Hello and welcome back to Game of Trades, your #1 channel for videos on the stock market and cryptocurrencies. So the manufacturing PMI came in last week below expectations at 46.3. Now PMIs, the ISM Purchasing Manager Index, is one of the most widely used measures of economic activity. It's a survey that actually goes back to the 1940s, so you have a huge amount of data to measure, backtest, and compare. Now, why is 46.3 such an important reading? Because it really does, for the first time, clarify that we are heading into an economic contraction. 48 is what is typically considered to be the break-even zone. You can see between 2009 and 2019, during the entire SP 500 bull run here, you never actually had PMIs go below 48. This really only happens in real recessions, and this reading has almost never not been accompanied by a recession. So I'm going to show you what that actually means for the SP 500. All the charts and data do seem to point that this is going to get much worse from here, and that we could possibly see economic activity, so PMIs, go down to levels that we haven't seen since the 1980s and 1940s, comparable to the contraction that we actually had in 2008. Make sure to smash the like button if you enjoy this video, and of course click on that subscribe button if you are new here. We make these videos covering the stock market, economic data, and any opportunities that we may see in the financial markets multiple times a week. Now, without further ado, let's get right into it. Now, quick reminder, there's only a few hours left to the special offer that we're doing, where we're giving you guys 1 month of free access to all the features on our service, so that you can actually try out the service completely for free, see the value that we provide, outperform the market, and hopefully join our community as a long-term investor that is determined to be successful in the markets. All you have to do is go to our website and click on the free trial, and you'll be able to begin 1 month of free access to everything that we do on here. So the manufacturing PMI came in last week below expectations. Now, why is that important? Because if I add the SP 500, you'll see very quickly that the relationship between PMIs and the stock market is incredibly close. And typically what you see is that the stock market and the PMIs usually bottom together. They very often bottom together. So typically, you don't see the stock market, the SP 500, bottom until you've actually seen the bottom in PMIs. So PMIs are starting to turn up, then you can see an SP 500 bottom, or they will occur right at the same time, like in 2008 here. PMIs bottomed as the market was bottoming at the same time. 1970 right here, the stock market bottomed just before PMI bottomed, but almost at the same time, right? Maybe a couple months before. 1957 bottomed at the same time. Now, are we actually surprised by the fact that PMIs right now are contracting? Not at all. Now, this is a chart that shows PMIs after yield curve inversions, which is something that we had back in August, right? This is the 10-year minus 2-year yield curve that gave us a bond market recessionary signal back in August of 2022. That's called a yield curve inversion. It has a perfect track record at anticipating recessions in 2007, in 2000, in 1990, and all other recessions that go back even to 1929. We've covered this many times before. And if we look at data going back to 1962, PMIs systematically move down following yield curve inversions. The only exception to that is actually 2006. The 2006 yield curve inversion didn't end up leading to PMI contraction directly after the yield curve inversions. PMI continued to stay pretty flat following the yield curve inversion. But this time around, it doesn't seem like it looks like 2006. It looks like most other episodes. Now, by the way, in 2006, that explains why, following the yield curve inversion right here, it explains why the markets continued to rally until around 2007. That was really an exception. Again, not something that we're actually seeing this time around. And also, this is the first piece of evidence that tells us that we should actually continue to expect PMIs getting worse in the next 6 months. So just based on this first piece of evidence here, if we assume that we continue to see PMIs contract in the months ahead, we should assume that the S&P 500 is not bottom yet. Now, of course, if you're expecting a big economic recovery here, then yes, okay, the S&P 500 is bottomed, but that would be against what typically happens in most yield curve inversions. And in fact, this is not just any yield curve inversion. We've had the deepest yield curve inversion since the 1980s. Now, we've actually found that deeper yield curve inversions are associated with weaker PMIs, right? So this is basically a chart that shows you depth of yield curve inversions, right? The more on the left you are, the deeper the yield curve inversion, and this is PMIs. So the lower you are here, the lower the PMI. And you can see there's a clear relationship where the deeper the yield curve inversion you get, the lower the PMI actually goes. So if we look at this yield curve inversion that's the deepest since the 1980s, well, we could assume that we'll get to PMI contractionary levels similar to the 1980s, which got to around here, below around 40 here. So that's the second piece of evidence that tells us, right, we are in contraction territory, but we probably have more to go, both in terms of the downside and in terms of how long that's going to last, at least over the next 6 months. Now, the next question I'm going to answer in this video is, what type of setup do you need to see typically for PMIs to bounce and for then the stock market to bounce? What are we looking for? What is the signal that we're actually waiting for that's going to confirm that we're about to see PMIs bottom, economic activity pick up once again, and the stock market to rally once again? By the way, don't forget to smash the like button if you're so far enjoying this video, if you're learning something new from this. It helps out the channel so much, so it is really appreciated. So let's try and answer that question very easily by adding the unemployment rate. And what you're going to quickly see is that you never see the PMI bottom without the unemployment rate rising, right? And I'm going to show you that very easily just by quickly putting all the vertical lines at PMI bottoms, right? Every time you see that black line really bottom out at the bottom of a recession, well, that typically is associated with a moment where the labor market is weakening very substantially. You can see every single time, and there are a couple of exceptions that I'm going to talk about in just a second. You can see here 1960 PMI bottomed around here before springing back up, and you can see unemployment was rising. Same thing in 1957, bottom in the PMI here. Unemployment was absolutely rising. And I can do this all day, but you can see every single time you do see a bottom in the PMI, you have the unemployment rate that is rising. Every single time that you have the PMI that is in contraction territory that gets to these levels, so around 46, and you see at bottom, that typically only happens when the unemployment rate is rising. And there are two big exceptions to that, and that is 1996 and 1967 here, where you can see in both of those cases, you didn't have the unemployment rate rising. The reason this happens is because when you start to get into those readings, it means that the Fed has been tightening monetary policy, which has been the case, right? And so you're starting to enter a recession. And when you start to enter a recession, the labor market weakens. And when the labor market begins to weaken, that's when the Fed can stop hiking rates and begin to ease monetary policy. And let me just add the Fed funds rate on top of this chart, and you can see every single vertical line that you have here. Just keep your eyes on those blue vertical lines here. Every single time it comes at a moment where the Fed has been easing monetary policy. Every single time, no exception here. It comes when the Fed has been cutting rates for some time because the unemployment rate has been rising, right? And so that's what happens when unemployment begins to rise. That's when the Fed can say, hey, let's stop the hiking cycle, let's cut rates, and we can create an economic boom. And that's when you see the PMIs boom again. So that's as simple as that. Now, what happened in 1995 and 1967 is that the Fed actually cut rates immediately without seeing unemployment rising. You can see in both of those instances, the Fed cut rates very quickly, but unemployment in both of those instances wasn't really rising. it was pretty stable. We weren't really in a recessionary type of spiral. Is that something that we can actually expect this time around in 2023, that we see the Fed cut rates, even though we haven't seen any type of weakening in the labor market? My bet would be absolutely not. If you put the inflation rate on top of this chart, you look at where inflation was in both of those instances. In 1967, inflation was at around 2.5%. You can see here on this axis right here, 2.7%, and in 1995, 2.6%. So just above the target rate of the Fed. So with inflation at 2.5%, that definitely gave the Fed room to say, okay, the labor market is weakening and inflation is just above our target rate. So we can actually start to cut rates here and stimulate the economy again without risking an inflationary spiral. In 1995, it worked. You had an economic boom and you didn't have an inflationary spiral. In 1967, they cut rates and you had an inflationary spiral that led to the inflationary 70s because of that big economic boom. But that's very unlikely to happen today because inflation is at 6%. The Fed knows that if they cut rates too quickly here, they risk the possibility of an inflationary spiral. And they've mentioned that many times. They do not want to repeat the mistakes of the 70s. And cutting rates now with inflation still at 6% would be repeating the mistakes of the 1970s. So it doesn't seem like we have the setup today where we can expect PMIs to bottom. And so it doesn't seem like we have a setup where we can expect the market to really bottom, because there's a lot of evidence right now that's pointing to the fact that economic activity can and will continue to weaken until the Fed cuts rates significantly. And that is unlikely to happen without the unemployment rate beginning to rise, which has not happened yet. So I hope this answered a few of your questions. I hope you learned something new in this video. If you did, again, don't forget to smash the like button and click on that subscribe button if you haven't already. Now, in the meantime, I wish you good luck on your trading and see you next time.